All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to present to you our findings on our gender equality report and ranking, which we've just released a couple of weeks ago. Just so you know, I have started the recording, and you'll be able to access this if you send us an email afterwards. We're happy to share, and you can share it with colleagues if needed. So we're really pleased to be talking you through how we do our research at Equileap, the data, how it can be used for clients and by companies. And we'll also be presenting our findings analyzing 4,000 companies in developed markets. We'll also make some time for questions at the end, so please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please make sure to pop them in the Q&A box and not in the chat box because we won't be looking at the chat quite so much. And in general, thank you so much for being here. So we have 4 speakers from Equileap with us. We've got Deanna van Naasdijk, who is our CEO. We've got Heather Larson, who is our Associate Director of Research. Myself, I'm Natalia Hussein. I'm a Research Engagement Specialist. And we also have Fatima Abbas, a Research Analyst. So I'll just hand over to Deanna to introduce everyone to Equileap and to our mission.
Thank you, Natalia, and welcome everyone. Taking some minutes here before we go into the findings to talk about Equileap and remind some of you what we do and why we do this. Equileap is a company with a mission. From the beginning, 8 years ago, when we started with the mission of wanting to close the equality gap in the workplace. And a lot of different strategies had been used within a movement of gender equality, but one had not been used yet, and that was using investments as a way to encourage companies to speed up, take a leap towards gender equality. And in order for investors to do this, they need data. So what Equileap is, and what Equileap has, is the largest database on gender equality around the world. And we make this data available to investors so that they can really take that proactive correspondence or meetings with the companies, conversations with the companies, but also create products with a gender lens. So what do we have in our data set? We have a little bit more than 5,600 publicly listed companies around the globe. These companies are listed in more than 45 economies, and they cover both the developed markets and the emerging markets. We researched the companies on 21 gender equality indicators, which you will hear about later on, and we have 10 years of historical data. What this means is that our data can be used to create products that would have a benchmark, whether it's the MSCI ACWI or MSCI World, or any of the countries that we cover within their main indices. So enabling investors to make better decisions. Why is this important? It's important from a social perspective, from a human rights perspective, but it's also an interesting thing that it is, research has shown us that when we invest in those companies that have more gender equality and better gender balance, that actually it's the smart thing to do and that these companies do better financially. There's one research that I would like to point out, done by Glenmead, an asset manager in the United States. They looked at the Russell 1000 and they scored the Russell 1000 companies on gender equality scores of Equileap and found out that the top quintile outperformed the bottom quintile going back 6 years by 2.3% on average each year. But we've also seen similar research by BlackRock and by many other institutions, universities, and organizations. So it's safe to say that when you invest in gender equality, you're actually getting a double impact. You're getting the impact on society, and you're getting a financial impact. To date, we're very proud to see that there's more than $8 billion invested in different products tracking Equileap indices or data. And here you see some of them. And we hope to see this also increase in the years to come. Finally, how is our data used? It's used just like any other ESG data. So we've got the data that you have for free on the reports on our website and where you're going to hear about today. But we also see that you investors can capture the raw data, can license the raw data from us, and can use that for ESG integration to create ESG products or ESG scores where the S is strengthened with the gender equality data of Equileap. Portfolio analysis, reporting back to clients, index constructions, which are being used for ETFs and structured products, shareholder engagement. We see more and more clients looking at our data and then communicating directly with the companies on where they're doing well and where they're not doing well on gender equality and controversial screening. And the final sheet, just to let you know that we have a vast array of products. You can come to Equileap, send us an email at info@equileap.com if you're not a client already, and we can give you samples, we can give you access to our data on our trial. And the product suite on gender equality has a number of different data sets that you can see here listed. But we are also, since last year, have expanded into racial equality and LGBTQ support, and we have a number of data sets that are touching upon these important intersections, bringing true equality to the work that we want to do. I think that that's it for me. And now I will pass it on to our Associate Director of Research, and that's Heather Larson, to explain to us the methodology that we follow when we do our research.
Thanks, Deanna, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm just going to take a few slides here to walk you through our research process, scorecard, and introduce you to our team. To start with, to come up with this comprehensive data set on 5,600 companies, we've had to develop quite a comprehensive and robust research process over the years. We look at each company, so all 5,600 every year. We update the evaluations between January and November every year, looking for all of the newest data that these companies publish. So we look for data in their annual reports, sustainability reports, on the websites, new policies that they published, press releases, etc. So anything published by the company. And first, we start with desk research. So we have a team of remote researchers and reviewers who gather all this data, look at all 19 criteria on the scorecard, all 21 indicators that we cover. They gather that new research, make initial decisions, and then send it to our core research analysts. And that's for part two. So for part two of the process, our research analysts do a peer review of the data. They go through various indicators, various questions that have been raised on the research, and really do an in-depth quality assurance process to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible. Next, once we've done our internal evaluation, we send preliminary scorecards to all of the companies in our research universe. So that preliminary scorecard has all the values that Equileap has found for that company this year in this evaluation. And we ask them to do data validation. So give us feedback on these. Some of them say, yep, that's great. Everything's good. Others will give us feedback, propose new values and information. And this is a good opportunity for us to engage with the companies if there's anything that's been misinterpreted, if there's any outstanding questions, something that we didn't fully understand in the data. It gives companies a chance to understand how we're evaluating them specifically, and also to bring forward any new information that may have come up since the time of research. So this is an important part of the process as well, to ensure that our data is really up to date and accurate. So after all of these steps, we end up with a finished data set. So then we'll move into how we're actually evaluating these companies. So what indicators are we looking at? So this slide shows the Equileap Gender Equality Scorecard. As I mentioned, we have 21 indicators that all end up in the data set that we send to clients, and then 19 of those specifically are scored. So the ranking and the scores that you'll see in the report, those are all based on the 19 indicators. So looking at the whole scorecard for category A, well, we have 4 different categories that contribute to our scorecard, all of different weightings. So category A looks at gender balance in leadership and the workforce. So we define gender balance as 40 to 60% women at each level. And we're looking at board of directors, executives, senior management, and the workforce. An additional indicator that we provide to clients is the gender of the CEO, CFO, and chair in the company. In category B, we're looking at equal compensation and work-life balance. We're looking for whether a company has published a commitment to pay a living wage to all employees, if they publish their gender pay gap. So we're looking for, and this is a more complicated one, but we're looking for transparency on the gender pay gap, a strategy to close the gender pay gap, and also performance. Have they actually closed the gender pay gap? Those will all contribute to a company's score. We look at parental leave, whether the company is providing both primary and secondary carers paid parental leave. We take into consideration the company-sponsored leave as well as statutory leave in a country of evaluation for the company. Finally, for this category, we look at flexible work options, and that includes flexible work hours and flexible work locations. For category C, we're looking at 8 different policies that all contribute to gender equality, but also an equal and safe workplace. Some examples are an anti-sexual harassment policy, as well as more supplier-focused policies, such as a supplier diversity policy that includes women-owned businesses and social supply chain management. The last category we have is commitment, transparency, and accountability. And we're looking for really specific things here. We're looking for the company to be a signatory to the UN Women's Empowerment Principles. And we're also looking for the company to have undergone a gender audit and received a certification from that. So there's a few different ones that Equileap recognizes as very high quality. We're also looking outside of the scorecard, and these are part of the different data set offerings that Deanna mentioned. We also monitor gender equality controversies, so looking at class actions, individual cases, and official rulings, looking at gender discrimination in the workplace, sexual harassment in the workplace. And we also have a data set on controversies for race and ethnicity controversies. So our research team, as I mentioned, there's a couple parts of the research process. This is our core research analyst team. All 6 of us have had extensive experience as research analysts, know the scorecard in and out, from junior researchers to senior researchers, people who are more specialized, so Natalia in engagement, for example. And this is our core team that really does the peer reviews and then the analysis of the data. Then we also, an integral part of the team are 10 remote researchers in India. So we've worked with this team for over 5 years. They do that data gathering, that initial collection of the data and decision making. So they do this really bulk of the research work. And then we have weekly calls. They deliver us weekly batches. We have calls with them, review the work, do a lot of feedback engagement every week. So we work very closely with this team to ensure that we get new and updated data every week, every quarter, and every year. And we work very closely with them. So now I'm going to pass things off to Natalia Hussein, who will start with the findings from this year's 2024 Gender Equality Report and Ranking on Developed Markets. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Heather. So delving into some of the figures from our 2024 report, and just as a general note, we're going to be talking about some highlights, some standout points here. Of course, the full detail can be found in the report on the website, as well as our previous reports. So please do go and head over there to have a look. But this report that we're looking at now, I'll just give you some details. We evaluated 3,795 companies during the course of 2023. And all of these companies had a market cap of $2 billion or higher, US dollars. They're all listed on major indices, and the companies span across 27 developed markets. And the methodology used to research them was as Heather described. So we gather publicly available information, and then it also includes the company engagement process. In terms of key takeaways, a few things that stand out were firstly that year-on-year progress is unfortunately very slow, and the journey towards gender equality continues to be unfinished. As a context point for that, during the most recent report, the average gender equality score for companies was 44% out of 100. So definitely a lot of room for improvement there. But by contrast, in 2023, that average score was 41%. So there is some very clear, noticeable improvement happening each year. We also find that legislation continues to play a really strong role in the performance of companies, especially things like mandatory disclosures and quotas for various management levels. We find that these are a really helpful jump-off point for companies. They won't necessarily help them to reach the high levels, but it can be a great place to start. And then finally, we see that corporate management and leadership are unfortunately still very male-dominated. This is a strong reminder that change needs to be seen at the top of companies and not just in company culture or in lower ranking representation. It needs to really span across the board. So for some detail, first, we're going to look at gender balance, and here emphasizing the point really that representation does matter when it comes to gender equality. And at Equileap, we define gender balance as being between 40 and 60% women at all different levels. We have that range to allow for some flexibility because we understand that 50% can be quite hard to nail on the head every single year, but that's the goal, 40 to 60%. So here we've got a comparison 2023 and 2024 at 4 different levels: the board, the executive team, senior management, and the workforce. And we've also added in the CEO here for an extra point of comparison. And you'll see that the picture has remained mostly the same year on year. Each category has increased by 1 or 2 percentage points. But the overall spread, the overall trend that we see is that the workforce is the closest to gender balance. And then unfortunately, that drops off really quickly as we get into the higher ranks of internal management. The board tends to have slightly better representation of women, partly because it might be easier for a company to bring in someone externally, or maybe they have quotas that they need to fill. But it's really interesting to see that that's not the case. That same effort is not put in with the internal management. So that's a really important place to focus on. In terms of the best performers, we do see that some companies are able to reach that gender balance at every level. So we found 32 companies this year out of the 3,795 evaluated who reached gender balance at all 4 corporate levels. And it shows that it really is possible to reach that high-hanging fruit. We're now going to be looking at some top countries on the aggregate level and top companies at the individual level. So this heat map shows how essentially all countries are doing on the gender equality scorecard that Equileap uses. So if we start off by focusing on the left, here we've got the countries ranked in order of average performance. So the top 5 countries this year were France, Spain, the UK, Norway, and the Netherlands. And then if we look right to the bottom, the lower performing countries were Israel, Hong Kong, Japan, and the USA. If we jump over to the right-hand side, that's where we see the average score out of 100 on the Equileap scorecard. And unfortunately, you'll see that even at the very top, with France on 57%, that's still a very low average percentage. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done across the board. If we look along the top here, we can see the indicators on the scorecard. So taking a look at the colors, green means that countries are performing on average well on those indicators. Red means that they're not performing well. So if we look in detail at a couple of the green ones, overall, we see that policies, so for example, training opportunities and non-discrimination in recruitment tends to be pretty good. And we also see human rights policies, these more general things that promote gender equality at large. Countries tend to do very well. And then if we jump over to look at some of the red zones, unfortunately, living wage commitments are very low across the board, with the UK being a little bit better there, with the Living Wage Foundation doing a lot of great work. And then also if we look at the gender pay gap, that's a bright red line. In terms of disclosure, we'll go into that a bit more in a minute, but in terms of performance, that's where the red comes in. A lot of companies are struggling to close their gender pay gaps. Another red zone is supplier diversity. So at Equileap, we look specifically for companies to procure from women-owned businesses. This is something that the US tends to do quite well on, but unfortunately, European countries not so well. And then, interestingly, if we look at the beginning of the scorecard, we see some mixed colors. So executive teams and senior management, we've got a bit of green, a bit of orange, a bit of red. So there we're really starting to see some differentiation between countries. So this is the top 10 list of the most recent report. So the top 10 companies. If we look at the top 3, we've got Transurban. That one is an Australian road operating company. They came first this year, reaching 80% for the first time on our scorecard. That hasn't happened before. Then at number 2, we've got Storebrand, which is a Norwegian financial services company. At number 3, we've got Diageo, a British beverage company. And you'll see they're all hovering around the 79 to 80% mark. So compared to the global or the developed markets global average of 44%, they really are leading the way. Something really encouraging to note as well on this list is that the sectors are really diverse. So we've got industrials, we've got consumer staples, we've got real estate, materials. And I think it's very helpful to see that dispels the myth, essentially, that some industries are just always going to perform badly with gender equality. It goes to show that the companies that put in the effort really can reach those top scores. And so we can hold companies to high standards. Okay, looking in a bit more detail at the gender pay gap, as Heather mentioned, there's lots of different ways that we assess this. We actually have 5 separate submetrics that we look at. And in terms of disclosure, we see a huge variety of reporting. So we see adjusted pay gaps, which is often equal pay for equal work type figures. We also see unadjusted gender pay gaps, which are usually means or medians that have not been, where factors like tenure and age and experience have not been taken into account. So it's a whole range, and we do give credit for all of these. However, for the top performing, the top scores, that's where we have more stringent requirements, which I'll go into in a minute. For basic disclosure, so disclosing any kind of average difference between men and women's salaries at a company, we're seeing a gradual increase, which is really promising. So in 2023, we saw 22% disclosure rate, and in 2024, we saw a 33% disclosure rate. So this is a very pleasing increase, and it's at a much faster rate of change than quite a lot of our other indicators. It's also something very useful for companies themselves to analyze, because for them, it really highlights structural inequalities, and it can be a helpful start point to know where to target your gender equality initiatives. So this splits out gender pay gap disclosures by country. So if we look at the best performers first, we've got Spain, where 100% of companies are disclosing their gender pay data, followed by the UK, Italy, and Norway. And all of these countries do have legislation in place that requires companies to disclose this. So this is where legislation really plays a role. And then if we look down at the other end, we've got the US and Hong Kong with incredibly low disclosure rates. And we're really hoping to see an increase there over the years as the higher performing companies lead the way. What is promising to see is that there are quite a few countries listed here that don't have legislation in place, and yet companies are starting to do this kind of disclosure voluntarily. So we hope to see more of that in future. Okay, this is where the really high hanging fruit comes into play. So in terms of closing the gender pay gap, the way Equileap defines that is companies need to have a mean unadjusted gender pay gap, which covers the entire company, including the most senior levels, and the pay gap needs to be 3% or less. So it's very hard to reach, but it is possible. And we see that just 1% of companies have actually done this. So it really goes to show that there's a lot of effort that needs to be put in. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Fatima to continue taking us through some of our core indicators.
Thank you, Natalia. Hello, everyone. I'm quite excited to be a part of this webinar, and let's continue with our findings. So one of the key policies that Equileap looks at is how companies combat sexual harassment. And this year we saw that 65% of companies globally publish an anti-sexual harassment policy. Now, this is quite encouraging to see because if we look back to only a few years, we'll see that this global average was below 50%. Here you'll see a country-wise breakdown of this policy, and we'll see that Spain is leading the way in terms of publishing anti-sexual harassment policies, where we see 95% of companies are publishing this policy. Now, one of the reasons behind this is the fact that Spain has in place strong legislation that holds companies accountable towards addressing sexual harassment in their workplace. After Spain, we see that Italy and Netherlands are leading this way with 81% and 77%. And even if we look at the findings overall, we'll see that more than half of the countries here are either at or above the global average. The countries that are lagging behind are UK, Hong Kong, and New Zealand. Here, we really need to see more companies commit to more transparency in terms of publishing an anti-sexual harassment policy. Now, let's talk about parental leave. So before I go into our findings, I want to talk about how Equileap evaluates parental leave. As mentioned earlier, we look at the leave offered to both parents, so primary carers and secondary carers. And the way we give credit to companies is that we give companies credit if they offer a paid leave of 14 weeks or more to primary carers, and if they offer a paid leave of 2 weeks or more to secondary carers. Now, ideally, we want companies to offer an equal leave to both parents. But the reality is that we see a lot of differentiation between primary carers and secondary carers in general, and we do factor that in. Now, keeping in mind the ideal goal we want companies to work towards, which is equal paid leave, we see that this year only 11% of companies offered an equal paid leave. Now, this is far from ideal, but compared to last year, it has improved. Last year, this was 9%. So we do see more companies offer an equal paid leave. And if you'll see our report, you'll see a mention of the top 25 companies that offer an equal paid leave. On top of that list, we have a Japanese company that offers an equal paid leave of 52 weeks to both parents. In that list, you'll also see that there are many companies from the UK and some from the US that are offering an equal paid leave of 26 weeks. So we're really hoping that these companies can become trendsetters within their sectors, within their countries, and encourage other companies to follow in their lead. Next, I'm going to talk about gender equality in the supply chain. Now, what do I exactly mean when I say supply chain? I simply mean a company's suppliers, or the businesses it procures its raw materials or any other goods and services from. So if we take an example, let's say a company like Nestle, which has many products, and let's say we look at a product of theirs, Nescafe coffee, we're interested in knowing whether the suppliers of the coffee beans for this product, we want to know how the suppliers are treating their workers based in Colombia, in Brazil, and all other countries Nestle procures its coffee beans from. And we'd want to know this for all of Nestle's products. So any company within our data set, we want to look at the entirety of their supply chain and how are they treating their workers there. Now, before I move on to the findings or before we go into details, I also want to stress the fact that it is extremely important for us to pay attention to what's happening in supply chains as well as what's happening within companies themselves. The reason I say that here is that you may be surprised to see, but according to the International Labour Organization, there are 190 million women who are a part of the global supply chain. This is exactly why we need to pay attention to what's happening among companies' supply chains. Now, if we look at this chart, we'll see that there are 4 indicators that Equileap has which specifically relate to company supply chains. If I start from the top, the first indicator has to do with social supply chains. Now, what that means is that we want to know whether companies require their suppliers to expressly commit to prohibiting human rights violations like forced labor, child labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. And we see that 80% of companies have suppliers that do make that commitment. And here we also saw this year that companies from the UK and Italy were leading the way. Next, we also look at whether a company's supply chain has an anti-sexual harassment policy. So we also want to know whether suppliers, prohibit sexual harassment as well. And here we see that 40% of companies' supply chains do have an anti-sexual harassment policy. Then we also look at supplier diversity, as mentioned earlier by my colleagues. Here we want to know whether companies procure from businesses that are owned by women. And we see that 20% of companies have such a supplier diversity program. And here I believe that companies from the US and Canada are leading the way. Now, lastly, we also look at whether companies require their suppliers to pay a living wage to their workers. And here we see that only 11% of companies make that commitment. Now, again, this is quite a low number, but zooming out and looking at these findings overall, I think, again, it's extremely important to emphasize that we need to hold companies accountable for not only their own policies, but also the policies they have in place in their supply chains. And I think it's also vital for companies to ensure that their suppliers are equally committed towards gender equality. It's also interesting to see that if we look at this chart, when we talk about indicators like the social supply chain, we see that companies and suppliers are doing fairly well. But when we start moving towards indicators that specifically have to do with gender, we see that percentage drop significantly. And I think that's interesting because it reflects where companies and suppliers are willing to put in the effort. And when it comes to gender equality, a lot more effort is needed. On that note, we're going to wrap up our findings. Of course, there's a lot more to share in our report, but given the time, I'm going to wrap up here and hand it over to Heather to facilitate the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Fatima. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box and we'll work our way through them. I see that there's one already from the beginning asking if we look at whether a company makes political contributions to anti-gender friendly politicians. For example, if Microsoft donates to Trump, does that affect their score? This is a really good question, and I think it's important to look at the environment that a company is operating and how they're making an impact in the world. The short answer is no. This doesn't affect a company score. We don't look at political contributions. The reason behind that is it's the scope. So we're really specifically looking at workplace gender equality and then policies that affect the supply chain as well. And then looking at political contributions starts to become a bit of a I think quite complicated and a moving target. So it depends on whether a politician changes their politics. It becomes a lot more complicated, but definitely important to take this into consideration if you're making your own investments as well. One thing that we do to kind of like hold companies accountable to their actions. So they might have great policies, but what are they actually doing is looking at the controversies. And we give companies alarm bells, well, we call it an alarm bell. So they could be excluded from a financial index if they have cases against them that meet certain criterias or certain criteria. So certain sexual harassment cases, gender discrimination cases, to kind of hold them accountable. Thanks for that. We have, I think, a quick question. How many women did she say were part of the supply chain? 190 million. Yes, that was the number. Are there any common indicators stopping companies from achieving 100%? Yes, Natalia, do you want to take that one?
Yes, this is a really interesting one that varies country by country, actually. So in terms of the highest scorers, the most important thing there is to aim for gender balance and to aim to have women's representation pretty even across those 4 levels. That's going to really impact a company's overall score because we do place a higher weighting on representation. And obviously that's a long-term effort. that's never going to be an easy tick box. So it does require investment over the long run. In terms of other criteria, category B, which Heather went over earlier, which includes gender pay gap indicators, living wages, flexible work provisions. This is another one where it takes a lot of investment from the company. And so when they do well on those criteria, they really perform well on the scorecard and the rankings. But then on the flip side, if they don't, for example, if they don't disclose any gender pay gap data, they're not working towards closing it, there's no strategies, those kinds of things will also impact negatively. As a whole, with policies, we look for disclosure as a sign of accountability. If a company is committing to uphold human rights, for example, or committing to having an anti-sexual harassment policy, we hope that that means that they can then be held accountable by their employees. But on that front, there is a rising trend of all of those boxes being ticked. So it's more in the earlier categories that we're missing the crunch point.
If I can add to that, thank you, Natalia. I think what the companies really suffer when they're on their scores, when they're not publishing the gender pay gap. That's a very important one. Next to the gender balance, what we were saying. Supplier diversity, that's also indicators that many times we don't see much, and particularly the policy to supply from women-owned or women-led companies. And another one that I believe is important but not done as much is having a gender audit. That one's not top of mind of many companies.
Thank you both. I think next one I'll give to Deanna. How do you experience the interest from media in your reports?
The media gets very excited in the countries where the companies are doing well. So in this case, when we, as you saw in that heat map, it's countries like France that are doing great, well, doing better than other countries. The media really likes that. So it's either one of the extremes. When we put out numbers of this is going better, this is increasing, France is doing best. This year we were on the front page of the Financial Times in France, Les Echos. And that was with the good news. The media also will capture very bad news, but unfortunately, what I've noticed is that the media has gotten used to the idea or the message that gender equality is not advancing. So it has to be very, very bad news for the media to pay attention. But it has been encouraging to see, and this is the traditional media. When we see the social media, then it's the companies hitting the top 100 that push for the articles and push for the news anchors to pay attention. And so that has a very big role.
Thanks, Deanna. The next question is, do you account the average labor force participation in the countries where a company operates in your scores? For example, for countries where female labor participation is historically low, like Japan or Hong Kong? And do you keep records in your research of employment by country and region when the information is disclosed by companies? Essentially, we don't adjust scores depending on country, region, or sector. Even our scorecard is agnostic to all of those things. This is a part of our scorecard, though, is looking at the female labor participation. And some places it's quite surprising. We see very high female participation in the workforce, but very low female participation in for example, the executive. So there can be quite some variation. In terms of how we keep records, we have historical data sets. So I'm not sure if someone else has interpreted this different, feel free to jump in. But we do have historical data, so we can see each year how this changes in terms of just the companies that we're researching. So we're not looking at the overall employment rate in a country, but in the publicly listed companies, the 2 billion plus market cap, we have that information across years.
Maybe just to add to that a little bit as well, in terms of the philosophy behind the scorecard, the idea is really to compare all companies to each other. And so if we start to relativize based on what's going on in every single national context, which is going to be incredibly different across the more than 45 countries that we look at, it becomes less meaningful, because what we're trying to do here is provide a tool, provide this huge data set that enables people to sort through who's doing well and who's not doing well. And in terms of the mention of Japan and Hong Kong, yes, there is a slightly lower female participation in the workforce there, but that doesn't mean that those companies can't do well on our scorecard, because as you saw, we have many indicators. And we do see Japan, especially, for example, doing really well on flexible work provisions, on parental leave provisions, pretty good on gender pay gap disclosures now as well. That's slowly increasing. So things like that we recognize, and we recognize efforts towards improving gender equality, not just the current state of affairs.
Thanks. The next one here is, what data do you make freely available and what is behind a paywall? Deanna? Yeah.
Sure, thanks. It's very simple. What we make freely available are these reports. And if you go to equileap.com, under the menu publication, you will find reports which are all readily available and free, and anybody can use and read. Actually, you can read it. You can use it for academic purposes. You can use it for information purposes. You cannot use it for investment purposes. If you're going to use, for example, the top 100 companies in our ranking, and you want to use it to create a financial product, please contact us and we will let you know what license you can take in order to use that. And then there's all the raw data, the thousands of data points behind all of these companies in our data set. It doesn't have a paywall. What you can do is contact us again at info@equileap.com and say that you would like to look at the data. We can send you some samples. We can give you a free trial, and then you can license the data. You will be able to receive that data as flat files, which come throughout the year, every quarter, and they're updated every quarter. And they're available in CSV or in Excel, and you can use that to incorporate into your systems.
All right. The next question is whether we have any thoughts on what are the most successful tools to create change after legislation. And that's interesting. I think we've seen various legislation working and not working, and I don't know if this is exactly the tools that have implemented them, or kind of the quality of legislation or the specificity of it. So hard quotas rather than soft quotas work much better. So in France, it's a requirement that there are 40% women on supervisory boards, on boards. And so that's been implemented. In Italy as well, there was a trajectory of kind of, in the first year, it has to get to this level. In the second year, it has to get to this level. And that also worked to great success. In the Netherlands, it was more of a soft quota suggestion. And it hasn't worked as well. We haven't made it to 40%. Also, the quota was for 30%. So that doesn't move the needle as much. On ones like the gender pay gap, requiring the publication of the gender pay gap publicly, then we see, of course, much more transparency. Whereas in France, companies have to report the pay gap to the government. We don't see as much public reporting. But then in places like Australia, we've seen really consistently high scores in Australia, or outperformers from Australia. And there's been about over a decade of gender pay gap or gender transparency indicators. So there's requirements to publish about what policies a company has. And so then companies feel motivated. Okay, we already have to have these in place. We already have to report it to the government. We might as well publish them and make some progress on them. So we've seen that be quite successful as well. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that one?
Sure, I'll jump in on that one. Thank you, Heather. I think the secret weapon, definitely. Well, it's two things, two secret weapons. In order to improve gender equality that are not legislation. Number one, it's the CEO. The CEO needs to care about this. The CEO of a company needs to say that this is important and this is priority. And that's when things will change. That we clearly see. And apart from that, it's transparency. So what Heather was touching upon, being able to publish and seeing where we are today, where the company is and what needs to change, is the number one encouragement to then move forward and capture the data as we move along. So apart from legislation, which is or targets, it's the CEO and transparency.
All right, the next one is, while the data clearly shows that there is sadly a long way to go, which indicator has been the biggest improvement since Equileap started, and do we know why? Maybe Deanna, since you've been here since the very beginning.
I think that's a very difficult question to answer, because we have these 19 indicators and they're all improving a little bit. Which one has the highest percentual jump? That's a good question. I think the research team needs to go back and check historically and see what we find. Gut feeling, I think that the improvement has been in category A in the transparency. So many companies, when we first started, didn't even know that anybody cared to know what percentages of women were in the management, senior management, workforce. We've seen a lot of transparency happening there and happening more numbers. I also think that some of the biggest jumps, even though it's very small, has been around the pay gap. But to know for sure, we would have to go back and look at the indicators. So thank you for that question. I think the team will go back and we'll figure out exactly what has been the highest percentage, and if I'm right, that it's the pay gap and the gender balance.
Yeah, I think even just looking at the gender pay gap in a really specific way, in Japan, we've seen disclosure on the gender pay gap go from 8% last year to 58% this year. That's a huge jump, and that's due directly to legislation. But when we see a country implementing that kind of legislation, it's really that really has a huge impact. And also, I think flexible work policies really changed after COVID. It used to be more flexible work hours and less flexible work locations, and it's really switched to quite a high number of flexible work locations. And we saw a big peak after COVID. Right. We have one more on, do you advocate on any policies within the US? If so, which bills? No, we don't actually do any direct kind of lobbying or advocacy work. But it would certainly be interesting to use our data to do that if someone wanted to. Right. What are the closest peers to your amazing index, Human Rights Campaign? Tiana, who are our closest peers?
There are quite a few great indices out there that look at corporates. Their work on human rights, I think, is probably one of the closest. There is the World Benchmarking Alliance, which creates a number of indices on different SDGs. But I haven't seen anything that does what we do, which is to really capture all the publicly listed companies of a certain size and above, and capture everyone, and then do these indices and rankings and indices. So I think in that way, there are others doing similar things, but we are quite unique.
I would add to that as well, something that's quite different in our way of looking at gender equality compared to a lot of other indices is that we don't just go with the board of directors or the representation of the workforce. We have 19 indicators, all with multiple submetrics. In total, we look at 48 submetrics. So ours is much more holistic, looking at workplace culture as well as the visibility of women. In that sense, I think we go a lot deeper.
And there's definitely complementary work as well. Like the question 19 on our scorecard, which is looking at a gender audit. So if you want to do a deep dive into a specific company or have your company evaluated, we would really recommend a gender audit. So they're looking at very similar topics to us, but more through employee interviews, looking like really a deep dive into policies and practices at a company. So again, complementary work, but different.
I think a question that was not asked, but usually I do get this question, is what can a company do to improve the gender equality? Companies are welcome to write to us and ask us for a bespoke benchmarking report. This is a service that we provide where we would tell the company how they are doing on gender equality based on the 19 criteria that we track. And the company can choose themselves which 5 peers they would like to compare themselves to and be benchmarked to. So that is one of the services that I'm very happy that Equileap provides. Apart from the reports we do and the data for asset managers, companies can also come to us for a bespoke benchmarking report, and we're happy to create that. Just send us an email at info@equileap.com.
Any other questions anyone has? We have a few more minutes. No? Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass you over to Natalia to close out.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending today. It's been really great to do this webinar for the first time, and we're hoping to do more of them in the years to come to share our research as widely as possible. I'd just like to remind you that you can read the full report on our website, and you can also, as Deanna mentioned, send us an email if you have any questions about using the data, to request a sample, to chat about a benchmark report if you're a company representative, and then also to look at how our data is used. We've got a whole load of examples on there. So this recording will be available afterwards. Again, also email us for that. We're happy to share it around, and we hope that you continue to have a really good day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.